and I'm happy to be here and to speak about body memory, which is the topic I chose also because this was the topic that basically brought me here some 9 years ago, and of course this was a very lively research environment where I could start and continue my work for basically 6 years afterwards. So there are also a lot of memory related to this memory topic, but I will go directly to the point I want to make, and which also has to do with a little change I made to the title, because while reviewing Thomas Fuchs's work on body memory, I realized that there is one systematic aspect that might need to be discussed more closely. And that depending on how we understand it, we will have to reassess the implications of body memory on self-experience, social experience, and their disturbances. I'm thinking about how we should conceive of the actualization or reactualization of body memory in the present situation. Following in particular Merleau-Ponty's account of habitual body, and considering it as an expression of body memory, Fuchs repeatedly emphasizes that body memory, by establishing acquaintance with particular situations, opens up new possibilities for action. To be sure, Merleau-Ponty's account of the habitual body takes up, in certain respects, Bergson's claim concerning mémoire habitude, according to which mémoire habitude is future-oriented. And here is a famous quote from Bergson, which Fuchs also takes up, and I just read the last part. So, habit memory is always directed toward action, based in the present and looking only at the future. It does not represent our past, it enacts it, end of quote. In Merleau-Ponty's terminology, we can say that the moment of actualization is a reprise of the past in a new situation, which entail a projection into actions directed to the future. In his general remarks on body memory, Fuchs takes up this approach. For instance, he writes that, quote, by installing itself in every situation, the body always carries its own past into the surrounding as procedural field of possibility, end of quote. And then, vaguely felt emotions and impulses may take shape in the sensing of the body, implying reverberation of forgotten or repressed contents, as well as forebodings and anticipation of possible future. In this way, body memory also opens a way to what is latently present in one's own life, and sometimes already known on a deeper level, end of quote. So what I believe would deserve some closer reflection is precisely the reference to possible future, that body memory opens up in and through the present actualization. I wish to argue that body memory can have both an opening and a restricting impact with respect to future possibilities, and that this difference depends on how the actualization of body memory occurs. With this remark, I don't want to just state the truism according to which saying that body memory, as everything basically, which opens up possibility, also closes other possibilities. I rather wish to emphasize the need for a more articulated discussion on the moment of actualization, because this could possibly also help us to understand the classification of body memory Fuchs makes. My suggestion is that we should account for a distinction between actualization of body memory that reveal the capacity to cope with the unexpected, with new situations and circumstances, and potentially also to transform itself, from actualization that do not reveal this capacity and potentially hinder adequate action and interaction in a novel situation. So the paper is structured as following. So I begin by introducing in what sense I want to say that body memory can open and close possibility. Then I go through Fuchs' typological classification of body memory and actually consider only, or in more detail, let's say, habitual memory and situational memory, and make just a few remarks on the other memory forms, and I come to some concluding remarks. So body memory, as probably everyone has in mind, I will be very quick on that, is often introduced in relation to the psychological research on implicit memory as distinguished from explicit memory. Explicit memory, to use a phenomenological vocabulary, consists in the conscious presentification or representation of past events, and that's biographical or episodic memory, or of acquired knowledge as semantic memory. Implicit memory instead consists in the operativeness of past experience, notably in the form of dispositions and skills, or of a sense of acquaintance and familiarity which we have experientially developed and which are actualized in the present. The acquisition of implicit memory is certainly the result of a temporal process of learning, yet we are not explicitly aware either of the processes that have led to the acquisition of it, of skills, for instance, or of the skills themselves. These are actualized in the present situation without any explicit recollection. And to sum it up, so in body memory or in implicit memory, the past is lived and not looked at. And then how comes the shift to body memory? So departing from an understanding of memory as a representational capacity and considering subjectivity and intersubjectivity as constitutively bodily. And this is one of the contributions, I think, of Thomas Fuchs. Body memory is considered as just the concrete expression of implicit memory. In other words, we can say that body memory is basically implicit memory insofar as the latter is lived through by bodily subjects. Resorting to Ryle's famous distinction, Fuchs also understands the distinction between implicit and explicit memory as parallel to the distinction between knowing how and knowing that. Accordingly, body memory is non-propositional and dispositional kind of knowledge. Although body memory has different forms, the general ambition is to offer a holistic account of body memory as the totality of our subjective and behavioral disposition, as my lived past, as the ensemble of all habits and capacity at our disposals. And these were two quotes. Fuchs also emphasizes that we should not understand body memory as some kind of inner depository, but rather as the capacity, it's a quote, the capacity of a living being to actualize its disposition acquired in early learning process, end of quote. Accordingly, body memory should not be located either in the brain or somewhere else in the body, but it is rather bound to the ongoing dynamic coupling between body and environment. Body memory, quote, precisely describes the body in connection with the environment as the carrier of habits and skill memory. It is not static or reproductive, but a dynamic memory, both in its formation through the body's interaction with the environment, as well as in its flexible reactualization through similar interactions later on, end of quote. So how should we understand the dynamics of body memory? So the question I want to raise is whether all reactualization testify to such a dynamic character. And to anticipate the answer, I want to argue that we should rather say that body memory, as the bodily enactment of sedimented past, can either open up possibility or instead represent an obstacle for a skillful actualization. Only in the former sense we can speak of a dynamics of body memory, for only in this case memory has some innovative potential, which is grounded on the appropriate grasping and experiences of the present situation. In the latter case, instead, body memory takes the form of a rather static repetition or replica of acquired patterns, and its actualization may not fit the present situation. One of the reasons why emphasis is generally on the dynamic skillfulness and adaptation, I think, is a problem that Thomas Fuchs, or a claim that Thomas Fuchs share with Merleau-Ponty, because on the one hand, both, it seems to me, want to avoid reducing body memory to a mere mechanical or reflex-like repetition. On the other hand, they do not want to they don't consider correct to understand adaptation and the grasping of a new situation as based on intellectual acts. So this is the structure of the phenomenology of perception, basically, avoid empiricism and intellectualism both. So if we go back quickly to Merleau-Ponty and consider his famous example of the experience organism, which Fuchs also takes up in his writing on body memory, Merleau-Ponty writes, "It is known that an experienced organist is capable of playing an organ which he does not know, which has more or fewer manuals and stops differently arranged compared with those on the instrument he's used to playing. He needs only an hour's practice to be ready to perform his program," end of quote. He then expresses his main concern by explicitly excluding that this is possible either because in the 1 hour rehearsal the organist has developed new conditioned reflex, so empiricism is excluded, or because she analyzes the organ and makes a representation thereof. The intellectualist is excluded. Accordingly, Merleau-Ponty emphasizes that this phenomenon shows, quote, that the whole problem of habit here is one of knowing how the musical significance of an action can be concentrated in a certain place to the extent that, in giving himself entirely to the music, the organist reaches for precisely those steps and pedals which are to bring it into being, end of quote. So in making such a generalizing remark, the whole problem, tout le problème, starting from this example, Merleau-Ponty also seems to restrict habit memory to cases in which such adaptation and competent application of acquired knowledge, even in altered circumstances, occurs. Yet shouldn't we clarify what precisely it means to be experienced, to be an experienced organist, for instance? Is body memory enough to account for such an experience? Cannot we take as another example of body memory, in this case habit memory, a very sophisticated kind of habit memory, the case of someone who is not able of such adaptation and can only play skillfully on a familiar instrument? Asking whether body memory always implies skillful action in altered circumstances is only one of the elements indicated that we need some distinction here, I think, and others can be brought to the fore if we consider at least some of the types of body memory Fuchs distinguishes. So I skip this. Here I wanted to say Merleau-Ponty conceives of the acquisition of habits also as rearrangement, a renewal, and the suggestion I want to make is that only in those cases in which there is a successful coping with the present, we can speak of such rearrangement and renewal. So Fuchs' account of body memory, I think, is both holistic and relational, so he wants to account for the totality of possible interaction and relational because it has to do with the relation between organism or subject and word, or organism and environment, but it does distinguish, as we have already heard, different kinds of memory, and more recently he has also addressed complex kind of cultural memory as a body memory. So I start with some consideration of habitual memory, which refers to the habitualization of the sensory motor capacities of the lived body. It allows us to acquire sensory motor skills and attitudes, to get acquainted with perceptual and movement patterns, to develop an individual style of interaction with the world, etc. Fuchs emphasizes that procedural memory is actualized in dynamic processes. Sorry, in dynamic processes, it's the last quote. So, procedural memory is actualized in dynamic processes, pattern sequences of movement, well-practiced habits, skillful handling of instrument, as well as familiarity with patterns of perception, end of quote. So what I want to focus at, and of course are the word I put in italics, namely well-practiced habits, skillful handling, familiarity, so all successful actualization. And the question I want to raise is exactly whether we should take body memory as the only condition for such successfulness. And I want to make two observations. The first observation is that procedural body memory or habit memory could also be responsible for unskilled or bad practice habits. Think, for instance, of someone who has learned to play an instrument in a non-optimal way, say the clarinet, by taking his or her fingers too far away from the key when playing. This way of playing is apparently not skillful because it does not allow to nimbly play quick passages, but it can well get sedimented in and through body memory. What the body, in fact, seems able to do, at least in certain cases, is to correct this unskilled behavior, either by itself or by means of explicitly guided exercise, or, and this is, I think, the most interesting case, to find its own way to reach the same result, in this case a well-executed performance, despite the generally inadequate habit. For instance, the player may become extremely rapid in his or her finger movements. Goldstein's analysis of movement disturbances deriving from brain damage, to which Merleau-Ponty extensively refers, can in several respects be taken as a case exemplifying analogous cases of bodily self-adaptation or compensation. The second observation I want to make is that acting skillfully also depends on the capacity to properly react to changed circumstances. Thus, to vary on Merleau-Ponty's example of the organ is above, take the case of a player who has learned to play a piece with his or her group in a well-known rehearsal room. The skillfulness with which she will play, for instance, during an open-air performance, will depend not only on what she has learned, on his or her body memory, but also on the capacity to adapt that knowledge to, or that know-how to different circumstances. For instance, the different acoustic in an open air, the presence of public, and so on. This capacity should be, at least to some extent, I think, decoupled from body memory. And if this capacity is not there, that is, if the body would just repeat what it has procedurally acquired in the rehearsal room without adaptation, then the performance would not be skillful, but still based on body memory. In this case, thus, body memory would not open up, but rather limit possibilities for action. So what I want to hint at with these two remarks is that phenomenology of body memory and of habitual memory in particular should be able to rule in some discriminant between what we can call, paraphrasing Ryle in the same chapter, intelligent and unintelligent actualizations. Ryle emphasizes that intelligent behavior or intelligent capacities should not be understood as knowing that, not as a kind of acquired propositional knowledge, but rather as a kind of knowing how themselves. Yet, intelligent capacity should be distinguished also from what Ryle calls mere habits. In restricting the notion of habit to unintelligent behavior, basically, it's obvious that there is a different conceptual use here. But what I think is important is that, so we have in Ryle intelligent behavior, which means knowing how, which basically largely coincide with what Fuchs means by body memory, and then we have habits, which are not the habits Fuchs means, because they are mostly unintelligent, and Ryle considers them as the mere repetition or replica of acquired patterns of behavior. And what I want to say is that phenomenology of body memory should also find a way to address the second, so or conceptually or phenomenologically address the second kind of body memories. And this is the quote by Ryle: "It is of the essence of merely habitual practices that one performance is a replica of its predecessor. It is the essence of intelligent practices that one performance is modified by its predecessor. The agent is still learning," end of quote. Even if one, again, may object that this is only conceptual distinction, I think there is also kind of descriptive and phenomenologically important point here. And what is particularly important is first that intelligent behavior is not itself propositional knowledge, even if it's not merely accidental. But it is instead a skill, a kind of knowing how. It does not rely on any intellectual or propositional operation going on in the inner theater of the mind. So if we agree that body memory, here particularly procedural or habitual memory, can be actualized intelligently or not, then such intelligence largely coincides with the capacity to learn from one's own mistakes related to unskilled habits. And I refer to my first observation, or the example of someone who has unskilled habits and then possibly corrects his or her own behavior, or with the capacity to adapt one's own performances to change environmental circumstances, and this relates to observation 2. In both cases, if body memory, here habits memory, is intelligent, then its actualization also bears the potential for transformation of acquired habits. If body memory is instead unintelligent, we would have a quasi-mechanical, one could say anyway, a replica of old patterns. I come a bit shorter to the second kind I want to address, situational memory, which describes body memory insofar as it extends to the spatiotemporal situations in which we bodily participate. It entails the involuntary emergence of memory images and impressions that are related to the atmosphere of affectively charged situation we have lived, and that are transposed in similar situations we lived in the present. Situational body memory is implicit memory for, I quote, holistic, inseparable units of bodily, sensory, and atmospheric perception, end of quote. Although each situation is unique, body memory underlies the implicit recognition of types of situations, as well as emotions and the activities that are related to such recognition. Fuchs emphasizes how intermodal, synesthetic, and expressive qualities contribute to such a grasping, atmospheric grasping of situations. So if we go to the example we find, so Fuchs makes following: a goal-getter in a football match who has a nose for dangerous situations in the penalty areas and shapes his action accordingly, or a sailor who someone feels the signs of the storm, or again a psychiatrist who arrives at a diagnosis by holistically grasping the patient's whole situation, and basically is primarily a matter of bodily resonance. I want to dwell a little bit on this example because this allows me to make a further short point, still by referring to Goldstein. Fuchs writes, "An experienced psychiatry," I quote, "considers not only the single symptoms and anamnesic data, but the entire impression she gains from the patient in his life situation. And the more her experience grows, the easier will she recognize the illness even during the first contact. Such knowledge may not be completely expressed in words. The encounter with a depressed patient is characterized by a certain atmospheric perception that is not analyzable in single elements. No textbook can replace one's own experience of a diagnosis and its peculiar coloring," end of quote. So analogously to the case of habit memory, what is emphasized here is that, in a sense, there is some successful actualization at play. So the question again is it always the case, and is the success related only to body memory? Again, I believe that the answer pretty much depends on what we mean to be experienced in this way. And if we take again this, I'll try to summarize what I wrote down. If we take again this example of the experienced daughter, it reminded me of some methodological remarks we can read in Goldstein's book when he tried to describe this method of analyzing the organism and its pathology, not just by listing symptoms, but by considering the totality of the situation and the environmental exchange of the organism And then he mentioned two possible objections. One of the objections is, well, when do you come to an end of the description? When do you know that you have arrived to a successful description in order to decide this patient has this or that pathology, for instance? And then Goldstein writes, well, the experience observer will feel when he comes to an end. And I think this has pretty much to do with this atmospheric recognition Fuchs addresses with, in terms of body memory. But I would say that, so Goldstein made clear that the Gestalt perception in this case is certainly based on previous experience, and we can say on body memory, but also on a capacity of what I would call a situational judgment that may even need to correct some acquired patterns of experiences. So some kind of body memory may need to be corrected, and one should be able also to take some distance from what has sedimented in and through previous experiences. So like this experience, being experienced in this sense, I think could be understood in two ways. So one could take a larger sense in which one has experienced different situations, for instance with patients, or I think this very or similar structure applies to school and teachers. And in a narrower, I think more sophisticated sense, one is experience when one is also able to act appropriately in the given new situation, even if this situation may differ even largely from all the ones that one has previously experienced. And this implies also the capacity to take some distance from and possibly revising or correcting previously acquired knowledge or knowing how. I don't have the time, and I think it would require a lot of discussion to make the passages to the other kinds of memory, which are also structurally more complex. But if we take the three forms of intersubjective or social memories Fuchs describes, so intercorporeal, incorporative, and cultural body memories, and if we look at the examples, I think one could pretty much find that there is this double possibility here as well. And I don't know, I just made here a couple of examples. You can think of fruitfully evolving interaction versus non-evolving and closest behavior between, I don't know, mother and child. In incorporative memory, you can take role flexibility against role fixation, take in a family someone who has grown up as the rebel of the family and who becomes the rebel in all situations or in different social situations. And similar, more complex observation could be made also in cultural and traditional closeness versus opening up to new to transformation, which also have a way of detaching from traditions, for instance. But yeah, it will be, I think, too complicated to go into that in more detail. I just want to make some short remarks before coming to the conclusions to pain memory and traumatic memory, because if one takes the distinction I have made as a kind of systematic lens to go through the list of Thomas Fuchs forms of body memory, one could say that when it is successful, pain memory is precisely a kind of intelligent body memory. And this means because basically there is no situation in which, for instance, we experience fire which is precisely identical to the one in which we first got burned, and however the body reacts in a way that tries to avoid pain without any kind of reflection, if it is successful. Differently, body memory, traumatic memory is one probably of the most dramatically closing forms of body memory, in which you have phenomena, very well known phenomena of reiteration, compulsion to repeat even without explicit awareness of the traumatic event, incapacity to distance oneself from the phantomatic presence of the trauma, etc. I come to the conclusion. So, given the heterogeneity of the phenomena addressed, all these remarks, of course, would need much closer analysis, but they already suffice to make the following suggestion concerning body memory. What I aim to show is that we should systematically distinguish actualization of body memory that open up possibility for action and interaction from actualization of body memory that instead block or obstacle such possibilities. I have tried to show why, even if one can understand the underlying motivation, particularly referring to Merleau-Ponty's concern, understanding body memory as eo ipso implying skillfulness and the capacity of adaptation risks neglecting all those phenomena which are still grounded on body memory but do not express these capacities. In some cases, body memory is coupled with the capacity to grasp the novelty of each situation, possibly of taking some distance from the acquired patterns of experience through a form of bodily reflexivity or adaptation, and even of transforming them, transforming bodily memory or transforming previously acquired patterns of experience in a productive way. In other cases, instead, present action remains fixed in the mere repetition of acquired patterns, and these rule out possible transformation and or adaptation. So I've tried to show how, although the general remarks on body memory seem to support a more uniform view, according to which, again, body memory implies skillfulness, the example Fuchs makes concerning the different memory forms support the claim concerning this distinction. And in particular, I just make a short observation. I think that pathological expressions of body memory in post-traumatic stress disorders, but also in dementia, may be understood as the capacity as based on this distinction. The two diseases are obviously very different, but in both cases, even if preserved and even if this preservation contributes to the patient's sense of self, the impairment of body memory seems to be largely connected to the moment of actualization. That is, to the difficulty to cope with present situation, to readapt or transform acquired patterns in a way that is presently appropriate. And if we agree with Goldstein considering illness in general as the lack of responsiveness, we can say that such a capacity of responsiveness certainly presupposes body memory, but it also requires some kind of emancipation from those aspects of body memory that would constrain our capacity for action rather than enhance it. So, last word, the intellectualist mistake, which Merleau-Ponty and Fuchs rightly emphasize, is to conceive of this emancipation either in terms of an intellectual capacity or in terms of, I don't know, some kind of bodily detached reason. But the previous remark, I think, on intelligence, flexibility, transformation, skillfulness, etc., prompt us to reassess the idea of judgment, not in antagonism with the body, but rather as, at least to some extent, bodily reflexivity, or as an expression of the embodiment of reason. Thank you for your attention.